Good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. Another wonderful day to get you in ahead of the curve. As we do here, we wanted to bring you stories and companies that are literally in ahead of the curve of global macro research and what we're seeing on a global scale. And today we're catching up again with Brian Ostroff from Arianne Phosphate. It was just probably 2 weeks ago that we had him on, but we felt it's time to have him back on again because we touched on a couple big themes that have popped up again. And it's such an important story. It's complicated. It is and it isn't, but we want people to kind of get their heads around this because we see a big opportunity here in this sector. Certainly it's not just Austin and I, but there's lots of people that are recognizing what's happening out there. We really want to kind of drive this home so people know that we're bringing them a lot of free education, a lot of knowledge. But also we ask you to hit that like and subscribe button. Come to our website, give us your email to keep you notified. It helps us grow and it helps us get this message out. So, Austin, Brian, how are you doing today, both of you?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me back again.
Always a pleasure, Brian.
Yeah.
Now, last time we had you on, Brian, we ran through kind of food prices and food insecurity and potential food shortages. We're seeing that become a lot more prevalent now, obviously, with the current political situations in both Cuba and South Africa. What is phosphate and how does it help us meet the critical need to solve these food shortages and help combat soaring food prices?
Yeah, great. Well, great question. And you're right. Look, you talked about it's complicated and it's not complicated. Very much on the not complicated side. Ultimately, phosphate is fertilizer. You need fertilizer to grow things. You need it to grow your crops. You need those crops to feed your animals, you feed us. So, certainly from that standpoint, you don't have to do a whole lot of digging. And guys, you're right. The last time we were on, just a couple of weeks ago, we had touched a bit on things like Arab Spring. And if you kind of take a look at when Arab Spring happened and what was going on in food pricing then, the argument was certainly made that what we saw in Arab Spring wasn't so much against or a revolt against current leadership. It was really, it's hard to rule over hungry people. And so, you had this huge price spike and you had that unrest and things obviously settled down, but you guys are on top of this. You see the prices rising again. And just a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, we saw unprecedented riots in Cuba, really spurred by food insecurity and South Africa as well. So, look, we're going to have to do something about this. We need food and we need to figure it out. And so, Austin, to your question, look, phosphate is a very important piece of that. What is phosphate? Phosphate's one of the three macronutrients in fertilizer, potash and nitrogen being the other two. I think interestingly, the dynamics for phosphate, or maybe it's the scariness of the dynamics for phosphate, that market's pretty tight because most of the world is short phosphate. We're by and large all importers, and that deficit gets made up by the Middle East and North Africa. But more to your question. So, what is phosphate? Why don't we dig into it a little bit more? Because as I do speak to people, I think that there is some misunderstanding there, and particularly just commodity investors, I think that are used to really gold and copper and even corn. When you go buy your ears of corn at the supermarket, you don't really see if there's a difference if it came from a farm in Nebraska or Iowa or Saskatchewan. But when you look at phosphate itself, there are differences. And I think that it's important to know the differences, understand the differences, and ultimately, look, I think that people, by understanding that, will almost come to get a greater appreciation for Arianne. So, look, not all phosphate deposits are the same.
Mhm.
Again, if you're a gold investor,
Yes.
you have gold coins, you don't know if that gold came from a mine in Nevada or northern BC or Siberia for that matter. But when it comes to the phosphate, because the deposits can have some differences, that phosphate will differ. So the big difference is most of the world's phosphate comes from sedimentary deposits. And what a sedimentary deposit is basically, it's like sand, and it's been eroded, it's evaporated seabeds, and it's basically crushed, weathered fish bones, dinosaur bones. Look, even in our bones, there's some phosphorus. So that's what they come from. And again, you're talking north of 90%. The challenge with that, however, is that there's a lot of other bad stuff mixed in there. So you've got radioactive elements like uranium and thorium and radon, and you've got heavy metals like cadmium. And it all gets blended in, and so you'll see these deposits and they'll have a higher in situ grade, maybe like a 20% of phosphate. But what matters is what's your end product look like? What percentage have you got, and that. And so look, let's deal with this for a couple of minutes. So you've got your sedimentary deposit, you've got all this kind of other stuff in there. And again, ultimately, we're talking about food, whether it's food by way of going on your crops or, in phosphoric acid, which is found in foods, or feeding your animals, it's food. And so you'd really prefer not to have this bad stuff in there. But we also need phosphate. People ask me, what's the substitute to phosphate? Is there a substitute? And it's starvation. 80% of the world's population goes bye-bye without mined phosphate. So, we deal with it. So these sedimentary deposits, they have these, bad elements. During the process of making the fertilizer, you're liberating these radioactive elements, which means your byproducts and your gypstacks, and it's got to be dealt with. And then your heavy metals are not coming out in the process, and so you're winding up with fertilizers that have cadmium in them.
Right.
So as an answer to that, or an understanding of how this could be a real problem going forward, the EU about 18 months ago wound up putting in legislation limiting the amounts of cadmium that could be in the phosphate that comes into the EU. And over time, that's going to continue to diminish. Now, the Europeans were the first to do this, but ultimately, I think that here in North America, we'll start to go that route as well. So the industry is going to have to pay some money. They're going to have to figure out how to filter this stuff out. It's going to make it actually more expensive, and really going to make some deposits unusable if you're dealing with countries that have these limits. So, that's the sedimentary side of things. So let's talk about what Arianne has, which is an igneous deposit. And so these deposits are fairly rare. There's maybe a dozen in the world. And they get formed differently. They get formed the same way as a gold or copper deposit does, in that as opposed to it being evaporated from the top, you had like a seismic event and the lava flowed in, and that carried the phosphate mineral, similar to gold or what have you. And so ours, an igneous deposit is really a lot more regular. when it comes to mining. If you can mine a gold deposit, you can mine this type of deposit or copper.
Right.
So it's hard rock, it's blast, it's crush, it's flow. Now, I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that. And so a lot of times I'll get something like this. Oh, I see that phosphate mine over there is a 20% in situ, and you guys are like a 7% in situ. How do you compete? And really the issue is it's not what your in situ is, it's what your finished concentrate is. So because our stuff is in essence virgin rock, we don't have any challenges with other bad stuff mixed in.
Okay.
So we don't have the radioactive elements, and we don't have the heavy metals. And so again, you might start with a 20% in situ grade that's sedimentary. You're going to wind up with a concentrate that's 30%. We're going to start with a 7% in situ, and we're going to wind up with a 39 or a 40%.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I think that's important to understand, because a lot of times when people look, they're not necessarily comparing apples to apples.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, what they should see, and originally you had brought up that presentation and on that slide of what is phosphate, there were 3 lines showing pricing. And that's another big difference, say, from gold. Gold is gold. It trades at the same price, 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, and it is what it is. When it comes to phosphate, you do get paid for your quality.
Right.
And so, for example, a phosphate, there it is. So, you've got 3 different grades of phosphate there in the bottom right. And as you can see, the pricing is different. And so the stuff that, the very high purity stuff that comes from an igneous deposit, that's the gold line. And that would be the path that Arianne is following. And as you can see, it's about a 50% premium over your benchmark phosphate. So really, that's key, right? When someone's looking at a project, how much money does it make? It's not what's the in situ, what's the this, what's the that. Oh, it costs more money to mine hard rock than it does sedimentary. All of that is true. But in the end, I sell my product for considerably more money, and that means I make more money. Yes, my costs are a little higher. Yes, my in situ grades are a little bit lower, but I will make more money. And look, we also know this. Environmentally, people care more. People will pay more. People will be regulated more. And so I think, if anything, when you look at that spread between kind of that high purity quality phosphate and kind of the lower end benchmark, that cost spread, I think, is going to increase, even more. And so, look, I think that we are in a very, very good place. And again, a very rare place. The only, we had talked on our last conversation a bit about security of supply. At the end of the day, the only other mines that are capable of producing a phosphate as pure as ours are in Russia. And so, again, I will continue to argue that Canada is a great place, relatively speaking. And so the world can find good, high purity, clean phosphate, here in Canada.
No.
And I think that that's just huge. It's something that we're all going to need. We're going to need more food. So that's really, I think, a key thing for your viewers to understand.
Yeah, and like we were talking just before too, and I pulled up International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank. And this is a longer time frame, and we don't need to wait this long. But by 2050, there's about 2 billion more people on the planet, and they're expecting a 70% increase in global food production. 70% right now. We're already struggling right now. And then you take into account ESG as well. And we've talked about that a little bit, of the expectation and demand of doing things responsibly, socially responsibly, environmentally sustainable. And that kind of ties into anybody who looks at, say, the electric vehicle market will understand the differences in lithium or nickel. They'll realize, okay, not all lithium's the same, not all nickel's the same. If you're looking at vanadium or rare earth, you realize, oh, well, rare earth there's lots of rare earth everywhere, but you have to process it. And once you process it, which you can't often even do in North America because the cost of a processing plant is like $1 billion, you send it over to China, they go process it for half the price, and they then control and dominate that market. You've got a situation here with Arianne Phosphate where you have that at first blush may look like, oh, it's not as competitive, but it's because of the purity. You don't have to go through all these extra steps of removing, let's say, a byproduct. You don't have to keep on refining and refining and refining and processing. And that's, I think, the part that people are missing specifically with you. But if anyone's wondering if this is a major theme and being talked about, there's lots of places. I mean, the World Economic Forum you can go to, they speak about it all the time. World Bank talks about food shortages and supply, and we're seeing it, maybe not mainstream news. You're not really seeing a lot on Cuba and South Africa and whatnot, but it's not hard to find. I mean, if you just Google in a little bit, you'll start to see that this is a very, very cognizant, to the minute issue. And if there's further lockdowns that come in September, October, November, and supply chain starts to tighten up again, if there isn't projects that are closer for North America to help that market, that's an issue. And I think that's I don't want to be the fear guy, that the fear mongering, but it is something we have to be very cognizant of. And this is what I think is such an important story to get, and for people to spend the time, research themselves as well. And of course, to have you on to help educate us about these differences, because someone might go, oh, well, all phosphate's the same, or this is that, or one's if this, and that distinction is huge. And that's, I think we really want to drive that home for people.
Yeah, look, we all know this. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And you look at the food chain, and the food chain is only going to be as strong as its weakest link. And it's made up of all kinds of links, whether it's the transportation of the food, or the growing of the food, or production of the food. I would argue that phosphate could well be the weak link in the food chain. And so, back to the comment about us kind of being a high cost producer, the reality is just the opposite. We're really not a high cost producer. If you look and it, costs us X to produce a ton of phosphate versus someone else, that's not how you compare it. What you compare it is, what is the concentrate, that level of concentrate that you're making. So if it costs someone $50 to make a 30% concentrate, and it costs someone, $75, $80 to make a 40% concentrate, it's cheaper. It is cheaper. So what I'm trying to point out is you need to understand this a little bit more, because where some people will look at us and say, oh, they're a high cost producer and I don't want to be in a high cost producer. The reality is we're actually a low cost producer. So, I think that that's key. And then again, all these other things that you talk about, our project, it's based on hydroelectric power. So it's renewable resource. Our haul roads that are required are already there. The nature of our phosphate itself is very, very clean. The tailings, not an issue. The byproducts, not an issue. So, The world needs more phosphate, absolutely. But I would even argue in a world that didn't need more phosphate, our phosphate coming onto the market, people will take ours over someone else's that has that lower quality and ultimately the much bigger environmental footprint. So look, I think that is key. I think it's important to understand. Andrew, you are 100% correct. Like, people have started to learn a little bit about the differences in lithium and nickel and what can be used for what. So look, I have every confidence that as this phosphate bull market continues and more people come to realize the opportunity in the sector, they will do their homework. They will come to understand the difference. But I really appreciate you guys giving me a little bit of a platform here and help your viewers kind of get the quick leg up on everyone else having to kind of catch up and learn.
Well, that's what we want. Like, we want to be able to identify these things. Sorry, go ahead, Austin.
No, I was going to say, like, it's important to stress that critical need. I'll let you go first, Andrew. Then I've got another question that's kind of more technical related. So I'll let you go first, and then
I'll wrap up my last kind of comment, because about ESG, and you mentioned it already, is that assuming there wasn't even the coronavirus, the pandemic, and the supply was like, okay, we've got stable, pretty good growth. This move in ESG alone, take everything else aside, the requirement and the desire for us to have less steps involved. So you don't have to remove the heavy metals. You don't have to do this. You don't have to have a tailings pond. All of these things, all of these ways to keep things a bit more sustainable. Everyone involved in ESG, from BlackRock all the way to JP Morgan to Goldman Sachs, will say we would rather have a better quality project with less of a footprint than something else. So just on the ESG angle, and I think it's critical, that's what makes your project so interesting, because that was misunderstanding of people thinking, oh, this is a high cost product. It's like, no, it's a high margin and it's a highly valued one. And that, I think, with that distinction, since we started to narrow it down, it was so good to get you to help us understand, and our viewers as well, so they're not thinking, oh, wait a second, I looked, I compared it, it didn't look like it was matching up. I said, no, we want to explain why this opportunity is and very specifically, once you accept the macroeconomic outlook and you see what you're up to, this is where it becomes very interesting.
Yeah, and even on the macroeconomic outlook, at the end of the day, markets go up, markets go down. Economies recede sometimes, and then you go through another upcycle, and it's up and down. But the demand for food is not up and down. We all want to eat. That's going to continue. Population's going to grow. The other thing, of course, is as economies become more prosperous and more people move, up in class, move, say, from the lower classes to the middle classes, which of course we're seeing in a lot of the developing countries. These people, their diets change. They want more protein, but if you want more protein, it means you need more grains to fatten up your pigs and cows and chickens. And so even as we move more towards protein-based diets, that is going to continue to drive your need for grains. So there's no denying it. It's necessary. We need it. And so we need to figure out how to get it, A, and B, how do we get it in the least disturbing way possible? And so, look, certainly on both those counts, I think Arianne gets top marks.
That's incredible. And so just a little bit more of a technical question here. I'll kind of backstory this with, I used to work in the golf industry. I managed a couple golf courses in Alberta. And come September, October every year, you'd take soil samples from your grass and we'd send them to a lab in Nebraska. They'd send us back a report that told us exactly what kind of fertilizer we needed to use and what kind of the breakdown was. So my question is, what is the standard kind of amount of phosphate that's used in fertilizer for farming, and does that fluctuate and change based on what region you're in?
You know what? That's a great question. The reality is there is no one answer. A lot really depends on, to your point, where are you? So what is kind of the base amount of nutrients in your soil anyway? And that could vary, based on geography, based on climate, based on rainfall. So you've got that, and also, what are you growing? Some crops are more intensive for phosphate, some more for nitrogen. So, one easy way to think about this is, you do need all three. Think about someone who has a bank account and they have it in three different currencies. They have US dollars, Canadian dollars, and euros, and they have balances in all of them. But as they go and they spend more time in Canada or Europe, they're drawing it down. And so if you need euros, you need euros. Having more US dollars isn't going to help you. So it's the same thing with the N, the P, and the K. If phosphate prices, let's say, outperform and get a lot more expensive relative to, say, the move in potash, it's not a matter of, okay, I'll just put twice as much potash on my field and less phosphate. What is it? What are you growing? I'm sure a lot of your viewers have heard the term crop rotation. What's crop rotation? Because certain crops will use more of one nutrient or another, ideally you want to rotate them so that you can use up some of that kind of additional nitrogen. If you're using something and always growing something that is phosphate heavy, then you're going to deplete that much faster. Right. So look, precision agriculture, what fertilizers where on the field. Look, the whole agri-tech business is booming.
Yeah.
Like to your point, we're pushing 8 billion people now. We're heading towards 10 billion really fast. Obviously we need fertilizer, but we need to figure out this other stuff too. So precision farming, new types of seeds that are drought resistant. But it all comes back to the fertilizer. You can engineer the greatest seeds in the world. If you don't have fertilizer to grow them,
doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. So, Andrew, back to your earlier comment that it's complicated, and it's not complicated.
Yeah.
It is complicated.
Yes.
Engineering these seeds is complicated.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's very simple. You need to grow it. You need to eat. And that's where, deposits like Arianne's are really important when it comes to what the world looks like, 10, 20, 30 years out.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on again, Brian, to help get us up to speed on this. I always love it whenever you can look at something and go, here's the link between your food and mining. No one ever would think, like, listen, you're mining for your food, basically. And it is, that's the case. And finding these situations where there's such strong demand, and it's a very simple story. If people spend no effort, they can get into complex very quick, and we won't go there, but we kind of touched a little bit of all the innovation and all the technology that's being applied in farming and in biotech. But just for right now, and to keep it simple, we need phosphate. That's our focus right now. And we have a project in Quebec, mining friendly, with a team that's very strong, well-known and recognized. And the stock is at a bargain price right now. So this is why we wanted you on again. And once again, thank you so much for taking the time. We can't wait to hear some more news. And we appreciate you helping to educate people, because a lot of this is just educating people into this sector and about the market.
Look, I appreciate it. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the platform. Again, this stuff matters. And of course, I'm a big believer in Arianne and the opportunity that comes with being involved in Arianne. But, you know, again, even setting that aside, this is important. It matters. People should be aware.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate the time, guys. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.
Awesome.
Take
You as
care.
well. Take care.